Hello everybody, it's your boy Proftrof. We're back here on the video. Okay, this is, we're doing some history today, okay. How Russia survived Mongols and Crusaders. Rise of Novgorod.
In the mid-13th century, the land that had once been the mighty Kievan Rus was a smoldering husk. Its cities and villages burnt down, its people slaughtered under a hail of Mongol arrows. However, one of them, the oldest Rus city, Novgorod the Great, was a world away from the devastation. Its walls still stood firm. The bells of the Nereditsa church still tolled, and its streets were a bustle with lively commerce. In this video, we will explore how a free republic caught between Mongol hordes to the east and Catholic crusaders to the west would scheme, bargain, and fight to survive. It's really weird that so many common day topics remain taboo. So we're happy to say that—
No more, man, please. I've seen too many ball shaving apps for one life, okay?
Mongol era.
Sorry. I'm sorry,
As you may recall from our previous episodes, Novgorod was the original capital of the Rus, founded by Rurik around 860. Even after Rurik's successor Oleg moved the capital to Kiev, Novgorod remained influential. The people of Novgorod had always been free-willed, so when the Kievan Rus began splintering in the early 12th century, the old northern capital emerged as one of the most dynamic independent powers. Novgorod ruled over a prosperous trading empire, with the city itself serving as a central hub of international commerce. This Novgorodian state had a unique system of government, as it was not a hereditary monarchy, but a republic since 1136, when the powerful merchant lords of Novgorod, backed by the general citizenry, overthrew Prince Vsevolod of Pskov. Legislative power in Novgorod was controlled by the Vicha, a form of public assembly consisting of nobles, clergy, merchants, and commoners. Novgorod still had a prince, but he had to be elected by the council and could be fired if necessary. That is not to say that the
Fire your
Novgorodian
prince.
princes became meaningless figureheads. In fact, a particular prince would soon emerge as one of medieval Rus's greatest military leaders, and to many, the savior of the Rus culture and faith. In the year 1220, a boy known as Alexander was born to the Vsevolodovich dynasty, who ruled Peroslavl and later Vladimir. The young princeling likely spent his childhood years learning to fight and lead men. It was probably due to this pedigree that in 1236 his father dropped him off in Novgorod, and the city council elected him to be their prince, beseeching the young noble to take charge of the city's military affairs.
Sure.
This was an incredibly tall order for a 16-year-old, as the city
Why my boy looking like a fucking model? Jesus Christ.
was in crisis. To the east, the unstoppable horde of Batu Khan was thundering across the Rus heartland, and it would only be a matter of time before the Mongols would come to Novgorod. In the west, the situation was just as volatile, as starting in the 12th century, various Latin Christian powers had made headways into northern Europe. The Vikings of Scandinavia abandoned their old gods by the mid-1100s and became more or less Christianized, which allowed them to expand under the pretext of Holy Crusade. The Kingdom of Sweden, in particular, began making ingresses into Finland, claiming it was converting the pagans of the region to Christianity, and by 1216, the Pope had recognized Swedish suzerainty over Finland. This expansion put Sweden on a collision course with Novgorod, who had economic and territorial interests in Karelia. The Catholic and Orthodox churches had finally begun to overlap in the north.
Shit.
Both sides desired land and power and considered the other to be heretics, so the potential for war was brewing. According to the Chronicle of Novgorod, in the summer of 1240, a Swedish army led by Bishop of Finland Thomas sailed up the Gulf of Finland in their longboats. They then proceeded into the Neva River with the aim of seizing control of
Thomas. Thomas, what are you doing here, Thomas? This is not your land, Thomas. Fuck off, Thomas.
over Lake Ladoga,
Bishop
and
Thomas.
from there, striking at the city of Novgorod itself. As the story goes, Prince Alexander wasted no time in rallying his Druzhina and confronting the Swedish host on the Neva, decisively routing the Western invaders. It should be noted that the battle at the Neva is never described in Swedish sources, and this has led some scholars to question if the battle at the Neva even happened in the first place. However, most agree it was likely an impromptu border skirmish rather than a full-scale invasion. Whatever the case, the young Prince Alexander had won his first military victory at the age of 19 and received his first sobriquet, Nevsky. Alexander's success.
At what age did he become a prince?
Had
won the
made him
battle
some
at
enemies
19.
as well, particularly the boyars and merchants of Novgorod, who believed that his war jeopardized the delicate trade relations in the region. Soon the political situation deteriorated to the point where Nevsky and his soldiers left the city. This was bad timing indeed, for the Swedes were not the only Catholics who had ambitions to take Novgorod territory. It is now we move our focus south to the dense forests of the Baltic Rim. Much like Finland and Karelia, this region was one of the last holdouts of paganism in Europe. The ancestors of the modern Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians had been fighting a losing war against German and Danish invaders, who sought to convert them to Latin Christianity by force. By 1228, much of the Baltic shore had been subdued by German Catholics, except for the Estonian coast, which became Danish. This land became known as Terra Mariana, the land of the Virgin Mary. It was an unstable colonial frontier, divided into several bishoprics, directly sworn to the Pope in Rome, but still inhabited by Baltic peoples who continued to resist Catholic overlordship through guerrilla warfare. Throughout all this turmoil, a pair of knightly orders rose as the apex predators of the Northeast. In Latvia and its environs, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were dominant, At the same time, directly to their south, the Teutonic Order waged a bloody crusade.
So, from playing medieval to Total War, I knew that the Teutonic Order was here somewhere. I wasn't exactly sure where. So I wasn't sure if it was here or here.
Against the pagans of old Prussia, establishing control over the region. However, the balance of power was soon to shift. In 1236, with the backing of the papacy, the Brothers of the Sword launched an expedition across the Daugava River to subdue and convert the Lithuanians. However, Lithuanian tribes took advantage of the swampy forests of their homeland, ambushed the knights, and annihilated their invasion force. So crushing was this defeat to the Brothers of the Sword that their remaining members had to join the Teutonic Order, now rebranded as
Brothers of the Sword, or like bitches of the sword. Sorry.
the Livonian Order. They quickly rebuilt themselves into a powerful, autonomous chapter of the Teutons, and this allowed them to wage a more effective war upon the indigenous pagans. By 1240, the Livonian Knights had established firm control on land as far east as Lake Peipus, and they now neighbored the Novgorod Republic. Once more, Catholic and Orthodox spheres of influence crashed together in Northern Europe. The Council of Novgorod was initially divided on how to deal with the ever-encroaching Crusaders. Initially, Slavic merchants prospered as trading partners with the Germans and Scandinavians, and intermarriage between the Rus and newcomer nobility was not uncommon. These ties to the West had been why Nevsky was forced into exile after his victory at the Neva. After all, what merchant would allow a glory-seeking prince to chase off their best customers? However, relations between West and East had begun to sour from 1224, when the Livonian Knights took Tartu, a city that Novgorod considered to be within its political orbit. The Crusaders also ramped up their efforts to convince the Novgorod aristocracy to convert to Latin Christianity, which irritated the Slavs, for whom their orthodoxy was the heart of their society. As diplomacy deteriorated, the German knights began to gaze greedily at the wealth of Novgorod, which in their eyes was a fair target as non-Catholics. Around the year 1240, Pope Gregory IX finally authorized a crusade against Novgorod, hoping that the Republic would be too preoccupied dealing with the Mongols to the east to defend. That same year, the Livonian Knights stormed the outpost of Koporye, conquering it with little resistance. They established a permanent garrison and began the construction of a stone castle, which made it evident to the people of Novgorod that the knights had come to conquer. Now in crisis mode, the Vicar of Novgorod turned back to the prince they had just exiled.
And they're like, hey, brah, you know how we exiled you like a couple years ago? And it was a joke. It was a joke. You took it too seriously. We meant for you to go outside, chill out for like a day or two and come back, brother. Nothing serious, no hard feelings, alright?
Begging him to return, Nevsky obliged, making haste for the northern capital. By the time he arrived, the Crusaders had taken Novgorod's sister city and breadbasket, Pskov. In the hands of an occupying force, it was a dagger pointed at the heart of the capital itself. Alexander knew that he had not a moment to waste, and in the autumn of 1241 he struck back, storming Koporye's brand new castle and capturing it swiftly. In the spring of 1242, he joined with the forces of his brother Andrei and thundered into Pskov, retaking the city with little effort, likely because the Teutonic Knights were preoccupied fighting the Mongols in Hungary at the time.
That is fucking hilarious. So the Pope calls the crusade now. Grab Novgorod because they should be busy with the Mongols, and yet they get destroyed. They lose a couple battles because they themselves are busy with the Mongols. What?
Nevsky's swift military successes can likely be attributed to his družina, the archetypal elite warrior retinue that had been a staple of Rus princes for centuries. Nevsky's force traveled light, taking towns and castles before their Crusader enemy had a chance to respond. A manner of warfare akin to his pagan ancestor Sviatoslav the Snow Leopard 3 centuries prior. Following these successes, Nevsky mustered up a citizen militia to supplement his Druzhina's limited numbers, and launched an offensive raid into Catholic Estonia, breaking his army off into contingents to raid and pillage the countryside. This was a mistake, for he had overextended his forces, and the Teutons and their Estonian allies managed to ambush and destroy one of the Rus raiding parties in an ambush on a river crossing southwest of Tartu. Nevsky decided to cut his losses and orchestrated a careful retreat. Meanwhile, the Crusaders had been hastily assembling an army for a second invasion into Rus lands. Led by Bishop Herman of Dorpat, it consisted of a core
Bishop Herman
of knights, alongside an allied contingent of Danish soldiers
God damn it, Herman.
native Baltic auxiliaries. By spring, they had begun pursuing Nevsky's army northwards. In April of 1242, the opposing armies met upon the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. Novgorod forces numbered some 5,000, while the Crusader alliance totaled at around 2,600. The Catholics may have been outnumbered, but it was Nevsky who was outgunned. Apart from the Prince's Druzhina and a contingent of allied Turkic horse archers, the Rus army was predominantly the poorly equipped, poorly trained militia raised from Novgorod's general citizenry. Furthermore, the Crusader
That's not good, but that's still 5k people to 2k people. That's more than double.
army had something the Rus did not: heavy cavalry. Nevsky was direly aware of the fact that in the hands of a capable commander, a single deadly charge from a few hundred mounted knights could rout his entire army in minutes. Nevertheless, against all the odds, the Novgorod militia held the line against the couched lances of the Black Cross, allowing Nevsky to successfully pull off a pincer move with his horse archer and Druzhina units, driving the knights and their allies off the field. The day had been seized by the East Slavs. This conflict, later immortalized as the Battle on the Ice, was a watershed moment in the relationship between medieval Rus and Catholic Europe. A permanent border between Novgorod and the Crusader states was established along Lake Peipus and the Narva River, and never again would the Teutons or their allies make serious ingress into Rus territories. For his victory, Alexander Nevsky earned immortality, known by all future generations of East Slavs as a saint who saved Orthodox Christianity. Now let us move back to the east and address the Chinggisid-shaped elephant in the room. While all this Crusader business had been happening, the Mongols had been ravaging their way through the northeastern Rus principalities. Nevsky's solution for the Mongol problem was simple: surrender. While other Rus cities mounted futile resistance against Batu Khan, Nevsky instead sent envoys, preemptively capitulating before the Mongols even reached his city, and accepting the Chinggisid Khans as his lawful overlords. Because Novgorod had surrendered so quickly and willingly, it was spared the destruction that other influential Rus cities were subjected to.
Hey,
Why was Nevsky?
they must have seen that even if the Mongols could conquer everything, they cannot hold it. They must have seen that shit. They must have seen that, like, once this dude dies, everything's gonna go like it usually goes with the Mongols. Everything's gonna fall apart. Everything's gonna be free again. Everything's gonna
be so
split apart.
willing to capitulate to the Mongols, but so insistent on fighting the Crusaders tooth and nail? The answer was simple. To those who showed proper obedience, the Mongols ruled with a light touch. They had no interest in influencing their subjects' religion, culture, or prevailing system of government, so long as they paid tribute without issue, and allowed the Mongol Khans to confirm their leaders. Contrast this to the Crusaders, who had every intention of forcefully eradicating Orthodox Christianity, and one can begin to see why the Novgorodians preferred a steppe warlord to a German bishop. Nevsky spent the rest of his life as a loyal vassal of the Great Khan, making many trips to the Mongol capitals of Sarai and Karakorum to pay his respects. The ruler of Novgorod used his submission to the Mongols as a key to political advancement. Indeed, the Mongol Khan bestowed upon him the title of Grand Prince of Kiev in 1246.
Prince of Kiev.
Of course, in the aftermath of the Mongol conquests, Kiev was a shell of its former self, but the title itself still held significant symbolic power and gave him an edge over other Rus princes who now competed for the Khan's favor. Alexander would only continue to grow more and more influential under the Mongols' wing. In 1252, his brother Andrei reigned as the Prince of Vladimir. However, when Khan Mongke ascended as ruler of the Mongol Empire, Andrei refused to travel to Karakorum to
Andre, what are you doing, Andre? You're fucking up the plans, Andre. Andrejka, Prejdzie. What are you doing?
have his princeship confirmed. As a result, the Golden Horde launched a punitive expedition into Vladimir, chasing Andrei out of his lands and forcing him into exile in Sweden. In his place, Nevsky was confirmed as the Mongol-appointed Prince of Vladimir as a reward for his continued loyalty. Nevsky paid off the confidence the Mongols showed him in dividends, defending their authority whenever the need arose. In 1259, when the citizenry of Novgorod revolted and refused to pay tribute to the Khans, Nevsky marched into the city with soldiers, forcing his own people to obey their Mongol masters by force
The people almost fucked it up for everybody.
of arms. Nevsky died in 1263, taken by illness while journeying home from one of his trips to pay homage to the Khan in Sarai. The Rus he left behind was a complex one. On one hand, invaders from the west were defeated, their religion saved in the process. On the other, it had been utterly ravaged by the Mongols, becoming subjects of a foreign empire. The legacies of St. Olga, Vladimir the Great, and Yaroslav the Wise remained in the form of their faith, culture, and identity that they had helped build. But as the various Rus princes slowly reconsolidated their lands and power under the watchful eye of Mongol overlordship, it became clear that the age of the Kievan Rus was long behind them. and a new era had begun in what would become Russia.
Русский.
We'll continue this series in the coming months, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description. To know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more.
Okay. What do you guys think? We're gonna be doing more history things on the channel for sure. Okay, so what do you guys think? Which video should we check out next? Let me know. Medieval history, pre-medieval history, whatever you want. I'm down for everything. As long as it has war, blood, tears, sweat in it, I'm down for it. No politician, please. That shit boring as fuck. Battles. That's cool. Okay. Quick thank you to everyone that supported the channel. Pedro Martinez, Kamas, Queen, Rob, Bear, Swastik, Future, Street, Senior Hilter, Lemon and Moon, Aikma Dash, Roddick, James Bzon, Ruga Hideki 25, Michael Museo, Nicola Georgiev, Shorty, thank you all for the support. As I said in the other videos, I'm gonna say it in all of the videos today. I made some emotes for the channel, so that if you're a member you can use the emotes, and we have new member badges. So when if you post something in the channel, you get a badge. While being a member, you have a badge next to your name. Okay, so you get to be extra cool. Anyway, if you wanna learn more about the membership, links to the description, usual stuff, everything's in the description. Anyway, hope y'all enjoyed this. Now, check you next time, buddy. Have a nice day.
Russia today is the largest country on Earth, and one of the most influential in human history. Despite this, the earliest origins of this massive nation are often neglected. This is certainly not for lack of interesting stories, as the cast of people that feature in early Russian history are nothing short of colorful. Welcome to our first video in our series on the history of Russia, where we will cover the ancient origins of this most enigmatic land. By the way, a quick aside, I'm Devin, the voice of Kings and Generals, pleased to meet you, and this time the video is sponsored by me. I actually made a turn-based tactics video game called Godless Tactics, and it's out now on Steam. You can explore an exotic future scenario, pick your own path through an open world of strategic choices, and use a teamwork-focused tactical battle system to resolve your fights. If you're into strategic thinking, do me a favor and go check it out. Link in the description, or search Godless Tactics on Steam. Search it in YouTube to find a walkthrough and see all the details first, if you like. For millennia, the grassy plains of the Ukraine and southern Russia, the Ponto-Caspian steppe, had been inhabited by a diverse cast of hardy nomadic people thriving along the Don, Dnieper and Volga rivers. The first written accounts of this land date back to classical antiquity in the 7th century BC. During this time, the steppe was dominated by various tribes of Iranian origin, the most prominent being the Scythians and Sarmatians. The ancient Greeks, who had a smattering of cities along the shore of the Black Sea, recorded stories about the nomads who lived to the north. Herodotus relates a tale that claims the Scythians were born of a union of the demigod Hercules and a serpent woman. Meanwhile, the Sarmatians were known for the legendary strength of their women, and therefore were considered a product of mixing between the Scythians and mythical Amazonian warriors. More historically reliable accounts describe these Iranic pastoralists as a sturdy people who lived and died on the backs of their steeds, subsisting on horse milk and meat, while enjoying the pleasures of psychoactive herbs and undiluted wines. For centuries, their domination of the steppe would be near unchallenged, but further to the north, a young and ambitious tribe was finding its bearings. These, of course, were the Slavs. The true origins of the Slavs are shrouded in mystery. The earliest written accounts of their existence come from Roman sources. In the 1st century AD, the senator and historian Tacitus described a tribe he called the Venedi, a people who lived primarily along the Vistula River. Tacitus noted that they built homes, carried shields, and fought unmounted, distinguishing them from their nomadic Sarmatian neighbours. Dismissed as yet another barbarian people by the classical civilizations, the Venedi were most likely the progenitors of all of today's Slavic nations. For centuries, these Proto-Slavs were hemmed in by their powerful Celtic and Germanic neighbours to the west, and Scytho-Sarmatians to the south. This changed between the 4th and 6th centuries as a great migration took place, with the Huns and various Germanic peoples migrating into the borders of the collapsing Western Roman Empire. Broadly speaking, this enormous migration allowed the early Slavs to expand beyond their original homeland in all directions. By then, the Venedi had diffused into numerous distinct branching tribes. Some tribes crossed the Danube into Eastern Roman territory, seizing lands for themselves in the Balkans and becoming the forebears of the South Slavs. Some tribes ventured westward into the domain of the Avars. There they carved a home for themselves and became the eventual predecessors of the Western Slavs. Most important to our story are the tribes who went eastwards into modern Ukraine. The Scythians and Sarmatians, who for centuries had dominated the steppe, were weakened by centuries of war with the Goths, Romans and Huns. The Proto-Slavs sunk their roots into this unstable region, eventually assimilating the last remnants of these ancient peoples. While we know little of this eastern migration, it is evident that in the following decades, Slavic peoples would continue to expand across much of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and central western Russia, intermixing with various clans of indigenous Finno-Ugrics and Baltic peoples, the ancestral cousins of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, and Finns. By 750 AD, the Eastern Slavs occupied land from Lake Ladoga in the north to the coast of the Black Sea. While they shared a common language and culture, the Eastern Slavs were not politically united, divided into many tribes that operated on complex kinship ties. They tended to avoid the high ground, settling along rivers and lakes where water was abundant. There they built strongholds with enclosed earth and timber ramparts, wooden walls, and an external ditch. These bastions were often surrounded by various peripheral villages, which provided grain and livestock. Not much is known about the native religion of the early Slavs, other than that they held to a pantheon of gods resembling those of their Indo-European cousins. The most well-attested to of these is Perun, their god supreme, wielder of thunder and lord of the sky. His eternal foe was Veles, ruler of the underworld, associated with magic, shamanism, and sorcery. There were of course many other deities, embodying fertility, fire, and the passing seasons, among other things. Pagan Slavs saw their gods as being tied intrinsically with the untamed wilderness in which they lived, and built their shrines in oaken groves. It should be noted that early Slavic society is reconstructed primarily through later Christian writers who looked upon their pagan forebears with disdain. Nevertheless, some information can be passed from the sources available to us. For example, the law of hospitality was the most sacred of rites to tribal Slavs. All guests were cherished without exception, and any tribe who mistreated an itinerant traveler would be attacked by neighboring tribes for their dishonor. War was not uncommon, both with the Balts and Finns and amongst the Slavs. They avoided pitched battles, instead fighting in dense woodlands with ample cover, while using short iron spears, heavy wooden shields, and bows nocked with poison-tipped arrows. The lives of the early Eastern Slavs were decentralized and chaotic, yet there was order and harmony through their shared customs. Nonetheless, things were soon to change as new arrivals came from the north on the decks of dragon-headed longboats. At the turn of the 9th century, the Scandinavian peninsula had a burgeoning population. In a cold, mountainous climate, good farmland was a rarity. This pushed the Norsemen to sail from their homes seeking new lands. Generally speaking, the Danes went westwards, where they became known to the English and French as Vikings. The Swedes, however, ventured to the east, where they quickly discovered the mighty rivers spanning down the continental mainland. By sailing down the crucial waterways of Eastern Europe, the Norsemen became deeply engaged in the trade networks that had existed in the region for centuries. At the confluence of the Kama and Volga, they encountered the Bulgars, with whom they traded furs, wax, and honey in exchange for silver. Occasionally, they rode further upriver and traded with the Khazars, whose control over the steppe had granted them rule over an incredibly wealthy land of diverse peoples, including many Slavic tribes. Meanwhile, those who sailed up the Dnieper soon found themselves in the Black Sea, and before long, the Eastern Roman capital of Constantinople. They called this splendorous place Miklagard, literally meaning the Great City. According to Roman sources, the Norsemen laid siege to the imperial capital in 860, striking like a lightning bolt from heaven, before ultimately being forced to retreat after a storm destroyed their fleet. With that said, the Romans were made to accept the Varangians as partners in commerce, making them wealthy with silks and wine. War and trade helped the Norsemen prosper, and that wealth meant they were there to stay. Of course, flying down the great rivers meant that the Norsemen inevitably passed through the Slavic territory. The Slavs called them Varangians or Rus, terms likely derived from the Old Norse words meaning pledged companions and the people who row. Initial interactions between them were hostile, as the Norsemen often raided Slavic villages, exacting tribute and taking slaves to trade in the southern markets. Within a few decades, the Scandinavians dominated not only the Slavs, but Finns and Balts as well. It would be this intersection of cultures that would give rise to the first united ruling dynasty in Russian history, the Rurikids. Before we explain the rise of the Rurikids, we should note that much of early Russian history is known through the Primary Chronicle, written in the year 1113 AD by a monk, Nestor. While his works are considered the most valuable source of knowledge on this era, the legitimacy of his work is often called into question by modern historians. Still, the Primary Chronicle presents the only complete story moving forward, and its tale will be the one presented by us. According to Nestor, the Slavs, Finns and Balts revolted against their Scandinavian masters at some point before 860 AD, driving them back across the Northern Sea. Evidently, the Norsemen had been something of a stabilizing force in the region, for once they had been expelled, the Slavic tribes quickly devolved back into habitual warfare with themselves and their neighbors. The Chronicle had this to say: "There was no law among them, but tribe rose against tribe. Discord thus ensued among them, and they began to war against one another. They said to themselves, 'Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law.' They went overseas to the Varangian Russes, and said to the people of Rus, 'Our whole land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to reign and rule over us.' The prince invited by the Slavs was named Rurik. Promptly accepting their offer, he settled amongst his new people in 862. Rurik established his capital on the Volkhov River, likely on the site of an older Slavic stronghold. His city soon grew to become a prosperous hub of river-bound trade, and became known to the Slavs as Novgorod. For 17 years, Prince Rurik worked to stabilize his realm, establishing laws and formal tributary rulership over the many native tribes of the region. He died in 879, leaving his realm to his kinsman Oleg. By all accounts, Oleg was the classic embodiment of a Viking warrior, an ambitious prince who sought to expand his lands through conquest. To that end, he turned his gaze upon the great Khaganate to the south. Ruling the crossroads of an international trading hub, The Khazars were naturally tolerant of the many tribes and religions in their domain. In one of history's more peculiar twists, the Turkic rulers had even converted to Judaism. Among their tributary subjects were the majority of the Eastern Slavic tribes in the south. For centuries, the Khazars prospered in their steppe land. Oleg, however, was not a foe to be trifled with. He had all the tribes of the north united under him and commanded a vast army comprised of Norse, Finnic and Slavic warriors. According to Nestor, Oleg sailed his army up the Dnieper River in 882, seizing the towns of Smolensk and Lubeck en route. Before long, they arrived upon the wooded hills of Kiev, an ancient outpost most likely founded by Eastern Slavic migrants as early as the 5th century. By the time of Oleg's arrival, Kiev was a vassal of the Khazars and was ruled by the Norse warlords Askold and Dir, who evidently were the ones behind the Varangian attack on Byzantium back in 860. Oleg is said to have confronted his fellow Norse rulers, decrying them boldly, saying, "You are not princes, nor even of princely stock, but I am of princely birth." Askold and Dir were promptly slain, and Oleg took firm control of Kiev. He was quick to see the value of this town. Kiev was surrounded by fertile soil, and its position along the Dnieper River gave it the potential to be a heart of trade and commerce. Oleg declared himself the Prince of Kiev, and decided it would be from there he would rule the rest of the realm. Soon he ventured on, wresting more Slavic tribes from Khazar control. By 885, the prince had united the vast majority of the Eastern Slavs under his rule. It is here that the Kievan Rus was born, a nation that would survive for 3 centuries and grow to become among the most prosperous in medieval Europe. Kiev was its grand capital, from which the descendants of Rurik and Oleg ruled as princes of the Rurikid dynasty. While Rus originally referred to the nation's ruling Scandinavian elite, in time, all the tribes of the Kievan realm, whether Slavic or Nordic, simply came to be known as the people of the Rus. Through fate and conquest, the Rurikid princes had given their names to the land, which Russia, the land of the Rus, retains to this day. Of course, the work of the Rurikids was far from done, and there are many stories still to be told, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one. The mighty Prince Sviatoslav was dead, and his skull now was the chalice of the Pechenik Khan, a grim reminder of the fate that oft awaited over ambitious conquerors. In the interregnum that followed his death, a great prince would rise amidst fire and blood, a man torn between the old ways and the new, who in time would be known as one of the greatest cultural fathers of Russian history. you know the sponsor of today's video, Magellan TV, is a documentary streaming service created and run by filmmakers that has over 2,000 awesome documentaries and the richest history content, spanning ancient, modern, current and early modern. But Magellan TV also has a phenomenal selection of historical dramas, and if you're interested in the history of Russia and want to delve into it, you'll find no better TV show than Ekaterina, Rise of Catherine the Great, which describes the rule of the brilliant empress, and Ladoga, which is based on the heroic Soviet defense of Leningrad during World War II. You can watch these dramas or the countless historical documentaries Magellan TV offers anytime, anywhere, on your television, laptop or mobile device, and it's compatible with most devices. The best part is Magellan TV is offering a 1-month free membership trial to our viewers. If you haven't signed up to Magellan yet, support our channel and do that at try.magellantv.com/kingsandgenerals. You'll get a free 1-month membership trial. Thanks to Magellan for supporting our channel. Upon Prince Sviatoslav's demise in 972, Rus was divided between his sons. The eldest, Yaropolk, ruled from the traditional capital of Kiev. The middle child, Oleg, ruled the rich land of the Drevlians, a tribe that had been thoroughly brought to heel by his grandmother, Olga. Finally, the youngest of the three ruled from the northern capital of Novgorod. The bastard son of a slave, he was overshadowed by his 2 half-brothers, and each of them were under the influence of the lesser lords, the boyars. For instance, Vladimir's domain was administered by his maternal uncle, the ambitious Dobrynya, while Yaropolk's realm was run by one of Sviatoslav's veterans, the Norse warlord Svenalda. With 3 puppeteered by ambitious men, the Kievan state was a powder keg just waiting to be lit. According to legend, that spark came sometime in 974, when the son of Svenalda, Lyut, wandered into the lands of the Drevlians on a hunting trip and was discovered by Oleg, who demanded to know who had the nerve to poach game from his forest. Lyut introduced himself as the son of Svenalda and was promptly executed by Oleg. We can assume this was done at the behest of his own scheming boyars. Back in Kiev, Svenalda was furious about the death of his son and put immense pressure upon Yaropolk to make war upon Oleg. The Norse regent was motivated both by vengeance and the prospect of controlling the rich Drevlian forest. Initially hesitant, Yaropolk was eventually cowed to Svenalda's will, and in 976 marched his armies into Drevlian territory. Oleg's forces were handily crushed by Svenalda. The prince fled with his army to the town of Ovruch, where in a frantic panic they trampled one another to get over the narrow drawbridge and behind the safety of the town walls. Yaropolk and Svenalda arrived a day later and demanded that Ovruch surrender Prince Oleg. Instead, the townsfolk pointed to their external moat. It was revealed that in the panic, Oleg, like many of his men, had been pushed off the drawbridge, where he had drowned in the muddy waters below. According to legend, Yaropolk ordered his brother's corpse to be dragged from the mire and laid atop a clean rug. Weeping heavily, he addressed Svenalda, "Rejoice now, your wish is fulfilled." In Novgorod, Prince Vladimir received the news of what had transpired. Advised that Yaropolk would likely attack him next, he fled to Norway to seek refuge with his relative, King Håkon Sigurdsson. Taking advantage of this flight, Yaropolk installed local boyars in Novgorod, effectively seizing control of the entire Kievan Rus. Vladimir, however, was not idle in his exile. Proving charismatic, the youth recruited an army of warriors in Norway and sailed back to Novgorod with his Vikings, kicking out Yaropolk's boyars and sending a message: "Vladimir is marching against you, prepare for war." Before his southward march, Vladimir wanted to secure an alliance with the powerful Ragnvald, the Viking ruler of the Polotsk tribe, who lived in modern Belarus. The prince sought a marriage with Ragnvald's daughter, Ragnhild, but was rebuked with disgust, as the latter claimed that she would never marry the bastard son of a slave. This rejection infuriated Vladimir and his uncle Dobrynya, whose sister was the very slave in question. The prince gathered his Viking mercenaries and all of the Slavic tribes of the north, conquered Polotsk, slew Rangveld, and took Ranghild by right of conquest. Vladimir then commenced his southwards campaign upon Yarapolk. His army soon overran the tribes of the south, forcing the Prince of Kiev to flee to the town of Rodnya, pursued doggedly by his vengeful younger brother. On June 11th of 978, Yarapolk gave up the fight, emerging from the city gates to make peace with his brother. Instead, he was cut down by Vladimir's Norse soldiers. The interregnum was over, and Vladimir now entered Kiev as the Grand Prince of Rus. Vladimir chose to commemorate his triumph over his older brother by reinforcing polytheism in his realm, uniting his followers by erecting not only Slavic, but also Norse, Finnic, and even Iranian gods on the hilltop above Kiev. Reportedly, the new Grand Prince was the archetypal heathen warlord. He feasted and feuded freely, while indulging in the company of 5 wives and over 800 concubines, many of whom he'd seized forcefully and enslaved. He was even known to engage in bloody rituals involving human sacrifice. Whether this portrait of a ruthless barbarian king is true, or the biased invention of later Christian chroniclers, we may never know. Like his father, Vladimir spent a good chunk of his early reign making war. In 981, his army seized much of Red Ruthenia, forming a borderland between the Rus and the powerful Piast kings of Poland. This would be the first conflict of significance between the Proto-Russians and their Western Slavic cousins, but as many are aware, far from the last. In the following years, Vladimir would suppress rebellions of his subject tribes, the Vyatichi and the Radomitians. He then turned his armies eastwards to the Volga Bulgars, defeating them in battle and making them subservient to him. Still somewhat under the influence of his uncle, Vladimir had grown into a ruler to be reckoned with. Yet throughout his early successes, the spectre of faith hung over him. We must now jump back in time and discuss the spread of monotheism in the east. The conversion of Olga in the 950s had been the Rus people's first real introduction to Christianity. However, the influence of the monotheistic faiths had been making gains in the states surrounding Rus for decades before that. The Latins and Greeks of the Frankish and Byzantine empires, along with the Muslims of the Persianized Abbasid Caliphate, were wealthy, powerful bearers of noble cultural legacies. As such, formerly animist and pagan peoples from Central Europe to the Eastern Steppe began converting to their monotheistic faiths to earn themselves a legitimate place in the political world of these economic and cultural heavyweights. The Khazars had been among the first to follow this trend. Before their destruction at the hands of Prince Sviatoslav, their ruling elite had adopted Judaism, the oldest of the Abrahamic faiths. Meanwhile, their neighbors, the Volga-Bulgar tribes, had converted to Islam in 922, seeking closer ties with their crucial trading partners in Abbasid Baghdad. Christianity had begun making headway in the 860s, when 2 missionary brothers, Cyril and Methodius, set out from their native Byzantium to spread the Orthodox Christian rite to the Slavic peoples. They traveled to the lands of Great Moravia, where they learned the local Western Slavic language and created for it a written script based on Greek letters, known as Glagolitic. Using their new alphabet as a cornerstone, they standardized many Western Slavic dialects into Old Church Slavonic, which became the new liturgical language. Now able to attend church services in a tongue familiar to them, the Western Slavs were Christianized. The Catholic rite eventually prevailed in Moravia, but Slavonic Christianity found success elsewhere. The Danubian Bulgars had converted to Greek Orthodox Christianity in 864, but didn't want to become too culturally dependent on their longtime Byzantine rivals. As a result, they welcomed the disciples of Cyril and Methodius into their lands, adopting the Slavonic church tongue over Byzantine Greek as the official language of their people, which is one of the reasons why arguably Turkic Bulgarians speak a Slavic tongue today. Furthermore, the Bulgars streamlined the unwieldy Glagolitic into something easier, the Cyrillic alphabet, named posthumously after Cyril. Prince Vladimir was slowly realizing that when his grandmother Olga had converted decades earlier, it had not been an admission of weakness, but an act of cunning. War brought glory to the Rus, but trade and commerce was the lifeblood of the realm. The princes of Kiev had maintained trade relations with their neighbors, but in order to deepen their ties with the wealthiest realms of Eurasia, they needed monotheism. Once more, it is Nestor's chronicle which tells us the legend of Vladimir's conversion. In 987, the Grand Prince had envoys sent to learn about Judaism, Islam, Latin Christianity, and Greek Christianity to choose which faith would be the best fit for his people. Vladimir was unimpressed by Judaism, pithily asking why a people exiled from their homeland could be a model to follow. Islam did not make a great impression either, as rather than venturing to the splendorous city of Baghdad, the Rus envoys learned about the faith from the Muslims of Volga Bulgaria, remarking, "There is no gladness among them, only sorrow and a great stench. Their religion is not a good one." Upon learning that Islam prohibited the consumption of alcohol, Vladimir remarked, "Drinking is the joy of the Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure." Meanwhile, the Rus emissaries who had travelled to the western lands of the Franks proclaimed that their churches were unimpressive and their Latin rites were without beauty. Only in the Eastern Roman Empire did the envoys find joy. In Constantinople they bore witness to the full splendour of Orthodox ritual within the opulence of the Hagia Sophia. Upon their return, they said to their prince, "We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth, nor such beauty, and we know not how to tell of it." Vladimir was sold upon the path of Byzantine Christianity, and the future of the Rus peoples was decided. Despite these colourful anecdotes, the real reason for Vladimir's choice was most likely a matter of pragmatism. Of the lands his envoys went to, Eastern Rome was the closest and richest, and furthermore, the expeditions of Igor and Oleg had already secured them a working, if rocky, relationship with the Greeks. Therefore, Vladimir stood to gain more politically and economically by choosing Eastern Orthodox Christianity over Islam, Judaism, or the Latin Rite. The Grand Prince was still a warrior at heart and wanted to convert on his own terms. To that end, he marched southwards with his army and took the Byzantine city of Chersonesus on the tip of the Crimea. From that position of power, he made a bold offer to Byzantine Emperor Basil II. "I have learned that you have an unmarried sister. If you will not give her to me, I shall do to Constantinople the very same as with Chersonesus." To the Eastern Romans, it was nigh unheard of for a Byzantine princess to be married off to some marauding northern barbarian. However, Basil was busy dealing with insurrection in his empire, fighting the rebellious general Bardas Phocas. He was in no position to open another front against the Rus. It was a decidedly better option to make an ally of them. Thus, the Roman Emperor agreed to give up his sister on two caveats. First, that Vladimir would send military aid to help him crush Phocas's rebellion, and second, that the Rus prince would convert to Orthodox Christianity, which he wanted to do anyway. In 988, the deal was struck. Vladimir was baptized in Chersonesus, renouncing his many consorts and marrying Princess Anna. He then went home, returning the town to the Greeks. True to his word, Vladimir sent a force of 6,000 Norse warriors across the Bosphorus, where they crushed Phocas's insurrection. So impressed were the Byzantines by these northern warriors that Varangian mercenaries would become the principal honor guard of the Eastern Roman emperors for centuries to come. Meanwhile, Vladimir's first order of business was to have his sons and boyars baptized, and he managed that with little difficulty. Next, he smashed the idols upon the hills above Kiev, which he himself had erected barely 10 years prior. On every street of the capital, town criers declared that by decree of the prince, every man, woman and child was to come to the banks of the river, where they would all be christened in a mass baptism. Some went willingly, while some were coerced by threats of violence. Whatever the method, the people of Kiev were all baptized in the waters of the Dnieper. Originally distressed at being forced to marry a violent barbarian brute, Princess Anna came to see in herself a holy duty. Throughout her reign as Grand Princess, she served as the principal religious advisor for her husband and founded several churches. The Slavs called her Tsarina due to her imperial heritage, and she soon became beloved among them. Indeed, Christianity soon spread beyond the heartlands of Kiev and into every corner of the Rus realm. The Greeks loaned Vladimir many architects, who built Byzantine-style churches where shrines to Perun, Veles and Stribog once stood. Meanwhile, the Danubian Bulgars sent their clergymen north as well. The peoples of the Rus soon came to favour the liturgy of the Bulgarians, whose Old Church Slavonic was much more closely related to their Old East Slavic tongue than New Testament Greek. Along with Church Slavonic came the spread of the Cyrillic alphabet, which remains in use in Russia and beyond today. This mass conversion was not entirely peaceful, as many still clung to the old gods. In Novgorod, the elderly Dobrynya spread the Christian faith as per his nephew's will. However, he was attacked by a violent pagan mob which set fire to his home and killed his wife. In the end, the old regent forced the city to convert by fire and sword. Pockets of the Rus undoubtedly clung on to the old ways for a time, but by the end of Vladimir's reign, all major cities and centers of commerce became Christian by persuasion or force. The rest of Prince Vladimir's reign passed relatively uneventfully. For nearly 2 decades, the Rus maintained a stable peace with all their neighbors, the lone exception being the Turkic Pechenegs, whose horse archers semi-regularly raided Kievan lands. In response, Vladimir had a network of fortresses built upon the rivers bordering the eastern steppes to fend off their incursions. This would simply be the latest chapter of a long struggle between the Rus and the steppe peoples on their periphery. In his later years, Vladimir was said to be a kindly ruler. In accordance with Christian precepts, he provided charity to the poor and sick, and made efforts to travel to the more isolated areas in his realm, listening to the petitions of those who otherwise would never have gotten to meet him. He passed away from natural causes in 1015, leaving behind a massively different country to the one he had inherited 30 years earlier. No longer was the Rus a land of warlords and tribesmen. It was now a veritable Christian empire, competing toe-to-toe with the successors of Greeks and Romans in economic and cultural influence. It is on this high note that we will end this episode. Next time, the Kievan Rus will enter its golden age, but even in a newly Christianized nation of saints and scholars, dark clouds loomed over the horizon. So make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one. The summer of 1015, the grand city of Kiev. A solemn day as the bells of the Church of the Tithes toll for the death of a great prince. Vladimir the Great had baptized the Rus and opened its doors to the wider Christian world. However, it would be his son that would bring the cultural, religious and political power of the Rus to its historical peak. Welcome to part 4 of our series on Rus history, where we will cover the reign of Yaroslav the Wise and the events that followed. The Grand Prince Vladimir had had many wives, and through them many sons, some more beloved than others. The most ambitious of these sons was Sviatopolk, the product of a forced union between Vladimir and a Greek nun. Sviatopolk had never felt his father's love, having been married off to the daughter of a Polish Duke Bolesław as a youth, and sent off to vegetate in backwater Turów. He had attempted to rebel against Vladimir as a young man, only to end up in prison. However, he was soon released, and upon hearing about his father's death, immediately beelined it to Kiev to claim the throne, which he did in late 1015. Svyatopolk soon found that he did not have the support of the Kievites, who preferred his half-brothers Boris and Gleb, who ruled the towns of Rostov and Murom respectively, and had always been the favourite children of Vladimir, likely to Svyatopolk's bubbling resentment. Boris had always been assumed to be the heir apparent of the Kievan Rus. Thus, when Svyatopolk took the capital, his boyars urged him to expel the usurper and take his rightful place on the Kievan throne. The Prince of Rostov declined and replied benignly, "If any man say, 'I love God,' and hateth his brother, he is a liar. Be it not for me to raise my hand against him. Now that my father has passed away, let him take the place of my father in my heart." One would imagine that this would soothe the usurper's paranoia, but Svyatopolk sent his boyars and caught Boris, brutally stabbing him and all his servants to death. According to legend, Boris knew his murderers were coming, but had sent his soldiers away, accepting his fate to prevent bloodshed. The executors then caught up with Prince Gleb on the river Smidden. It would be Gleb's own cook, bribed heavily, who would slit his throat. For these murders, Svyatopolk would earn himself the chilling epithet, the Accursed. Like his uncle Yaropolk before him, Svyatopolk had eliminated his brothers and seized control over the Kievan realm. But just like Yaropolk, he had not accounted for the old capital of Novgorod, and the young prince who reigned there. Prince Yaroslav was one of the youngest children of the late Vladimir, probably born of Ragnhild, the Polotsk princess who Vladimir had taken at the beginning of his reign. The young prince spent his early years cultivating the skills needed to be a decisive leader, maintaining relations with his relatives in Scandinavia, whose sagas referred to him as Yaroslav the Lame, likely due to the permanent limp he had received from an arrow wound in his youth, an indication that he was experienced in battle. Indeed, Yaroslav wasn't afraid to assert himself. During the tail end of Vladimir's reign, he had refused to pay tribute, and a war between father and son was only subverted by Vladimir's death. Yaroslav was shrewd enough to realize that he too would soon be under threat. In a turn of events eerily similar to his father's rise to power 35 years earlier, the young Prince of Novgorod marched against his kinslaying brother with a force of northern Slavic levies and Viking mercenaries. Svyatopolk rallied his forces and hired a mercenary army of Pechenek riders. The two armies met near Lyubek. Neither side dared to cross the Dnieper, and for weeks they stared at one another. At some point during the standoff, Svyatopolk's men began taunting Yaropolk for his disability, and calling his men carpenters, not warriors. "When we defeat you, we will make you build us a mansion." Deeply angered, Yaroslav's soldiers poured across the river and crushed the southerners in a vicious melee. Yaroslav then marched into Kiev, declaring himself the new Grand Prince of all the Rus, while Svyatopolk fled west. Svyatopolk had powerful allies in Poland, and his father-in-law was now the king. With Bolesław's support and German and Hungarian mercenaries, the accursed prince returned, seizing Kiev and forcing Yaroslav back to Novgorod. A brutal civil war would continue for another year, before Yaroslav finally defeated Svyatopolk in a battle at the Alta River in 1019. Svyatopolk died of illness while retreating back to Poland, and Yaroslav re-entered Kiev, declaring himself the Grand Prince. The Kievan Rus that Yaroslav had taken control of was a vastly different land to the one his father had inherited. Gone was the loose tributary confederacy of old, replaced by a centralized Christian empire. Yaroslav knew he could not rule his realm as a Rurikid warlord, so he set about becoming a just monarch, ruling upon the pillars of theology, learning, and law. The old ways of rugged pagan justice were no longer suited for a Christian ruler, so Yaroslav oversaw the composition of the first codex of Rus laws. The death penalty became rarer, and punishments became grounded in standardized fines, imprisonment and confiscation. The legal groundwork laid by Yaroslav would become known as the Russkaya Pravda, the Russian justice, and served as the basis of Rus law for centuries. Yaroslav also promoted literacy among his boyars, educating their children to read, write, and appreciate the finer points of biblical scripture. He built schools around his realm, and allocated large funds for the copying of manuscripts, which was an extremely costly endeavor at the time. His reign saw the opening of the first Rus monasteries, while Kiev soon became one of the largest cities in Europe, a hub of international trade and higher learning, rivaling the powerhouses of Constantinople and Baghdad. Despite this, Yaroslav's reign was still defined by civil war and external conquests. In 1024, his half-brother, Prince Mstislav of Timitarikhan, took advantage of his absence to launch an invasion. While Mstislav was unable to breach the walls of the capital, he managed to subjugate the hinterlands around it, moving his power base to Chernigov, a prosperous town right on Kiev's doorstep. The Grand Prince retaliated, assisted by Norsemen sent by King Anund Jakob of Sweden. He struck fiercely at Chernigov, but was decisively beaten by Mstislav's army. As a result, Yaroslav was forced to relinquish a good chunk of his realm left of the Dnieper to his half-brother. Thankfully, Yaroslav was soon able to turn his fortunes around by establishing a working relationship with Mstislav despite their recent conflict. Together they launched a campaign against the Poles in 1030, retaking the Cherven cities, which had been conquered by King Bolesław during his alliance with Świętoполk. Yaroslav would later establish peace with King Casimir the Restorer by marrying off his sister Maria Dobraniega to the Polish monarch in 1043. Relations between the most powerful nations of Eastern and Western Slavs would remain stable for a time. Back in 1036, Mstislav had fallen sick while on a hunting trip and died. Taking advantage of his untimely demise, Yaroslav was able to reinstate control over the entirety of the Rus realm. Not that he had much time to rest on his laurels, as the Rus capital of Kiev stood as a monument of opulence, tempting any warlike peoples to try and seize its riches. In 1036, it would be the traditional frenemies of the Rus, the Pecheneg horde, that galloped out of their steppe lands to besiege the grand capital, just as they had a half-century earlier. Yaroslav was in Novgorod when he heard the news. One can only imagine the fury he must have felt. Enough was enough. The Pechenegs had been a thorn in the side of the Rus for too long. Yaroslav immediately rode south, forming an army made up of the men of Novgorod, Kiev, and a large contingent of Thuringians, meeting the foe outside the walls of Kiev, where the two armies clashed. After a grueling struggle, the Turkic horde was crushed and routed. So decisive was this victory that from this point onward, the Pechenegs never again appeared as a significant player in Rus history. To commemorate his triumph, Prince Yaroslav commissioned the construction of the crown jewel of Kiev, St. Sophia's Cathedral. Yaroslav also undertook many outwards campaigns at the expense of the Lithuanians, Estonians, and Karelian Finns. At the end of his conquests, he had expanded the borders of the Kievan Rus significantly, turning it into a true empire. On top of his military triumphs, the Grand Prince had also expanded the diplomatic reach of the Kievan Rus further than ever before through a series of marriage pacts. On top of marrying his sister to the King of Poland, his son Vsevolod was married to Emperor Constantine IX's daughter Anastasia, and he bequeathed his three daughters respectively to Henry I of France, Andrew I of Hungary, and the famous adventurer king Harald Hardrada of Norway. These alliances enriched the Rus by deepening their trading ties to Western Europe, integrating the Kievan realm into the wider Christian world. However, as the Grand Prince grew old and weak, he began to fear for the future of his realm. The elderly Yaroslav had 7 sons, and he soon realized that upon his death, they would fight an endless string of civil wars. In an attempt to prevent this, Yaroslav divided the Kievan Rus among his sons, giving each one a piece of his realm to rule autonomously. In practice, his eldest son, Iziaslav Yaroslavich, was the heir apparent to the throne of the Grand Prince, but in practice, he was equal in power to his brothers, the princes of Chernigov, Pereyaslav Novgorod, Volyn Smolensk, and Turov. Yaroslav begged his sons to get along and act in the common interest of the realm. In 1054, he passed away, and the golden age of the Kievan Rus came to an end. The first existential threat to Rus unity came in the form of thundering hooves from the steppe. Yaroslav had crushed the Pechenegs, but all this had accomplished was to leave their southern grasslands open for their fiercer, more numerous cousins. The Cumans were much like other Turkic peoples, excellent horse archers, bellicose to a fault. The Rus called them Polovsti, from the Slavic polya, field, although there are other etymological explanations. They called themselves Kipchaks, and the land they took over Deshti Kipchak. By 1061, the Cumans had entered the Ponto-Caspian steppe, and 7 years later they decisively crushed the Rus armies of Kiev, Chernigov, and Pereyaslavl at the Alta River. This allowed them to establish dominion over much of the southern grasslands, choking off the Rus' access to the upper Don, Volga, and Dnieper rivers, crucial trade routes they had relied on for generations. After the battle, rebellions and civil wars erupted across the realm, and a popular uprising forced Iziaslav to flee to Poland. A year later, he returned to Kiev with the help of the Polish army, but in 1078 he was finally killed in battle by his nephews. In theory, this shouldn't have crippled the realm. Turkic raiders and civil war were nothing new to the Rus. Vladimir and Yaroslav had dealt with both in their time, and preserved the integrity of their realm. This time, however, there would be no great prince to lead the Rus back to glory. Other external factors led to the political and economic stagnation of the Kievan realm. Back in 1054, the Christian world was divided by the Great Schism, when the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople officially cut ties with the Catholic Pope in Rome, and as fellow Orthodox, the Rus sided with the Patriarch. As a result, the trading ties that Yaroslav had once cultivated with Western Europe declined. The Latin world came to see the Rus as heretics. Byzantium was not the powerful ally it once was either. In 1071, the Eastern Romans found themselves rocked to their core when a series of civil wars, following a devastating invasion of Seljuk Turks, saw them lose most of their territory. Between that and the Cumans cutting off the most prosperous river trade routes, the flow of wealth into Rus lands decreased significantly. Overall, Rus was becoming increasingly isolated. The branches of the Rurikid family became more numerous, and since Kiev was not nearly the hub of international trade it once was, these lesser princes began to identify themselves with regional interests rather than with the Rus state as a whole. As Kiev declined, the functionally autonomous principalities and republics of Vladimir Suzdal, Novgorod, and Halych-Volhynia became the main powerhouses in the East Slavic world. This tide of fragmentation would be stymied by Vladimir Monomakh, the last truly great prince of the Kievan Rus. He managed to somewhat unite the increasingly disparate Rus princes back under Kievan primacy in 1095, and even managed to briefly turn the tide against the Cumans in a pair of victories against one of their most powerful Khans, Bunyak, in 1107 and 1114. Monomakh's reign would prove the exception to the rule, however. The reign of his son, Prince Mstislav Vladimirovich, would be a grim return to form, seeing constant wars with Cumans, Estonians, Lithuanians, and rebellious Rurikid princedoms. By the time of his death in 1132, people still paid lip service to Kiev, but the reality was that the unity of the Rus was dead. Despite all their troubles, their darkest days were yet to come. Join us next time for the episode you all knew was coming as the riders of Chinggis appear on the horizon. To not miss that, make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.
Hello, hello everybody, it's your Hello, hello everybody, it's your boy
Today I'm going to
Proftrof.
speak to you about Saint Prince Vladimir, or Volodymyr the Great, the baptizer of Rus. My talk, as Michael said, is based on research from my first book, The Liturgical Past in Byzantium and Early Rus, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. The stories that we're going to be discussing come from a historical document known as the Povest Vremnych Let, which is translated as the Tale of Bygone Years, or what scholars now typically call the Rus Primary Chronicle or the Primary Chronicle. This chronicle is the earliest surviving East Slavic historical record. It was compiled, we think, in the second decade of the 12th century by monks at the Monastery of the Caves in Kiev. The biography of Prince Vladimir, which is found in the Primary Chronicle, spans a period of nearly 50 years. His reign is remembered reverently as a period of religious transformation. However, this did not prevent the chroniclers from divulging some of the more unsavory details of Vladimir's prodigal youth. A great sinner makes for a great convert, after all, and so the bookmen in Kiev did not shy away from recounting the deeds of Vladimir as a lustful and marauding pagan warrior. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume that not everyone has read the stories about Prince Vladimir in the Rus Primary Chronicle. In fact, I'm going to assume that maybe not everyone has even heard of Prince Vladimir prior to the talk today. As a result, my plan is to start with kind of a lengthy summary of Prince Vladimir's life and deeds as they're preserved in the Rus Primary Chronicle. Then, in the remaining portion of the talk, I'm going to turn to the subject of source studies. That is, the study of where these stories came from and how they came to be written down in the chronicle text. But before we get to all that, let's begin by reviewing the biography of the famed baptizer of Rus. Prince Vladimir was the son of this stoic-looking gentleman that you see here, Prince Sviatoslav, who was a feared warrior prince. But Prince Vladimir himself makes his debut in recorded history in the chronicle in rather hazardous circumstances. While still an adolescent in Kiev, his homeland was invaded by a tribe of Turkic nomads from the Eurasian steppe. And this is what the chronicle tells us. In the year 7476, or the way we count time, 968, the Pechenegs invaded Rus for the first time. While Sviatoslav was at Peryaslavets, so Olga shut herself up in the city of Kiev with her grandsons Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir, and the nomads besieged the city with a great multitude. Now, Vladimir and his brothers were eventually freed in a daring rescue attempt staged by one of their father's generals. Nothing more was heard about the young prince until 970, when Sviatoslav appointed him to rule in Novgorod, which you see an illustration of what medieval Novgorod might have looked like there. Novgorod was the most ancient city in the land of Rus on the banks of Lake Ilmen. 2 years later, Sviatoslav was killed while attempting to navigate the riverways back to Kiev following a successful military campaign against the Byzantines. Here's how the chronicle describes it. Sviatoslav approached the rapids and Kyria, prince of the Pechenegs, attacked him, and they killed Sviatoslav. They took his head and made a cup out of it, overlaying his forehead with gold, and they drank from it. With their father's head serving as a gilded drinking vessel, the supreme rank among Rus princes fell to Yaropolk, the oldest of Sviatoslav's 3 sons. He began to rule in Kiev, but soon a blood feud sprang up amongst the brothers. In 976, following a hunting dispute, Yaropolk and Oleg came to blows, and the younger brother Oleg perished in the skirmish. Fearing for his life, Vladimir fled back to Scandinavia, abroad to Scandinavia, and assembled an army of Varangians, or Vikings. 2 years later, Vladimir sailed back to Rus, retook Novgorod, and prepared to march against his brother in Kiev. And the princes of Rus were always warring with each other, by the way, regardless of the fact that they were all relatives. Now, Yaropolk refused to meet Vladimir in battle, and so a siege ensued. Vladimir eventually convinced one of Yaropolk's most trusted military advisors, a man named Blud, that he should betray his prince. The traitorous general persuaded Yaropolk to meet with his brother and make peace, but the proposed summit turned out to be a trap. And here's again how the chronicle describes it. Yaropolk came to Vladimir, and as he entered the door, 2 Varangians stabbed him in the breast with their swords. Blud then shut the doors behind Yaropolk so that his men could not follow him, and thus Yaropolk was slain. And here's a depiction of that murder in what's called the Radzivili Codex, which is this version of the chronicle from the 1490s, and which is famous for its colorful miniatures like you see here. And so throughout the talk, you'll see a number of illustrations that look like this. They're all from this very famous Radzivili Codex. Okay, so with both of his brothers now dead, Vladimir began to reign alone in Kiev. He took for himself Yaropolk's wife, who was a former nun, and she bore him a son named Sviatopolk. The prince also constructed idols on the hills surrounding Kiev, a practice that the monastic chroniclers strongly condemn. The chroniclers also made a point to condemn Prince Vladimir's prodigal lifestyle, and particularly his sexual appetites. Vladimir was overcome by lust for women, we learn in the chronicle. He had 300 concubines at Vyshgorod, 300 at Belgorod, and 200 at Berestova. He was insatiable in fornication, taking for himself married women and violating virgins. For he was a lover of women like unto Solomon, for it is said that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The prince's bad behavior continued in the chronicle passage for the year 983, an account known as the Tale of the Varangian Martyrs. This short hagiographical entry recounts the martyrdom of 2 Vikings, a father and son, instigated by Vladimir and his boyars following a military victory. In the passage, the prince and his people cast lots for a youth and a maiden to sacrifice to the gods, so human sacrifice. The lot falls on the son of a Varangian, a Christian, who steadfastly refused to hand over his son. And here's a 19th century depiction of this story. An angry mob subsequently stormed the Varangians' estate and murdered both father and son. The chronicler bemoaned the violence of these, quote, ignorant pagans, but praised the faith of the persecuted foreigners who have, quote, receive the heavenly crown with the holy martyrs and the just. Now, religious themes take center stage again in the year 986, when the prince is suddenly represented as exhibiting a keen interest in the doctrine and religious worship of other lands. Proselytes from the 3 major monotheistic traditions traveled to Kiev and presented their respective faiths before the court. The first to arrive were Bulgar Muslims. And Vladimir said, "What is your faith?" They answered, "We believe in God, and Muhammad teaches us to practice circumcision, to not eat pork, and to not drink wine. But after death," he said, "they will satisfy their lusts with women." Vladimir listened to them with pleasure, for he was himself a lover of women and great indulgence, but circumcision and abstinence from pork were disagreeable to him. Concerning drinking, he said, "For the Rus, there is joy in drinking. We cannot be without it." The next missionaries were from the Pope of Rome. They began to describe their beliefs and fasting practices, but Vladimir abruptly dismissed them, adding only that his ancestors, quote, accepted no such principles. Jewish preachers from Khazaria were the next to speak, and they also failed to impress the barbarian prince. Finally, a Byzantine philosopher appeared before the Kievan court. He sharply criticized the teachings of other delegates and briefly recounted the events of the Incarnation and Crucifixion. At this point in the story, Vladimir interrupts him and says, "Why did God come down to earth and accept such a passion?" The philosopher then answered and said, "If you wish to hear, then I shall tell you from the beginning." Vladimir said, "I will listen gladly." In a section of the chronicle known as the Philosopher's Speech, it's quite a long section, the Greek representative responded with an extensive exposition of the Old and New Testaments. He recounted to Prince Vladimir the history of the world from its beginning and concluded by showing him a curtain depicting the Last Judgment, with the righteous going to their bliss in paradise on the right side and sinners on their way to torment on the left. Vladimir sighed and said, "Happy are they on the right, but woe to those on the left." The philosopher replied, "If you wish to stand on the right with the righteous, then be baptized." Vladimir took this to heart and said, "I will wait a little longer," for he wished to investigate all the faiths. Vladimir then gave the philosopher many gifts and dismissed him with great honor. The prince launched this religious investigation in the annals for 987, so the year 987. He first consulted with his boyars, who counseled him to, quote, test the services of each land and how they worship God. Vladimir heeded their advice and sent off 10 good and wise men to inspect the religious rituals of the Muslim Bulgars, the Germans loyal to Rome, and the Greeks in Constantinople. So that is what the Rus called the Byzantines Greeks. Little attention is given in the chronicles of the first two expeditions, but the third is described in sumptuous detail. The emissaries arrived in the imperial city, and the emperor ordered the patriarch to celebrate the divine services in Hagia Sophia, so, quote, that the Rus might behold the glory of our God. Now here's how the chronicle describes this next part of the service. It said, when the patriarch heard this, he ordered the clergy to assemble, and they celebrated the feast as was their custom. They lit the censers and the choirs sang hymns. The emperor went with them into the church and placed them in a wide space. He showed them the beauty of the church, the singing and the archiepiscopal services, and the ministry of the deacons, and explained to them the service of his God. The Rus were amazed, and in wonder they praised their service. The emissaries subsequently returned to Rus and reported their findings to Prince Vladimir. They began by ridiculing the rights of the Bulgars and Germans, but their tone changed drastically when they related their experience in Constantinople. Then we went to the Greeks, they reported to Vladimir, and they led us to the place where they served their God. And we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. This is a very famous line from the Chronicle. And we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendor or beauty, and we are unable to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men, and that their service is better than those of all other lands, for we cannot forget that beauty. The boyars unanimously endorsed the Byzantine faith and reminded the prince that it had also been adopted by his grandmother, Princess Olga, who was known as the wisest of all people. Vladimir asked his boyars where he should be baptized, and they answered that the decision was up to him. At this point, the chronicle text for the year 987 abruptly ends, and the entry for the year 988 begins. So the famous year 988, right? The reader learns that Prince Vladimir is still unbaptized. He's taking his time, and he has resumed campaigning with his army. The target this time was Kherson, a Byzantine outpost on the Black Sea. about 350 miles south of Kiev. The prince and his forces found themselves mired in a protracted military siege, and they were beginning to grow impatient. Here's what happens next. Then a man of Kherson named Anastasius shot an arrow into the Rus camp, on which he had written, "There are wells behind you to the east. Dig down and cut off the one from which water flows in pipes." When Vladimir heard this, he raised his eyes to heaven and said, "If this proves true, I will be baptized." Shortly thereafter, the flow of water into Kherson was stopped, the inhabitants surrendered, and Vladimir and his retinue entered the city. The victorious prince subsequently sent a message to the emperors Basil and Constantine, threatening a similar siege of Constantinople unless their sister were given to him in marriage. And here's a picture from the Radziwiłł Codex showing the emperors trying to convince their sister to marry this barbarian Vladimir. So the emperors answered that they were unable to marry her to a pagan, Princess Anna, that is, but if he were willing to be baptized, he would gain her as a wife, inherit the kingdom of God, and be their companions in the faith. Prince Vladimir agreed to this request, acknowledging that he had tested their religion and found their liturgical services especially pleasing. After continued negotiations, the emperors sent their sister, Princess Anna, and a cohort of priests to Kherson for the baptism of her husband-to-be. The princess was reluctant to leave, suggesting that death would be better than the arranged marriage, but her brothers convinced her that she must do her part to save the empire from a bloody and costly war. Arriving in Kherson, the princess found Vladimir blind from a disease of the eyes, a misfortune the chronicler attributed to divine providence. So she instructed Vladimir to accept baptism immediately, otherwise he would never be cured. When Vladimir heard this, the chronicle tells us, he said, if this proves to be the truth, then the God of the Christians is truly great. Then he ordered that he should be baptized. The bishop of Kherson, together with the princess's priests, after catechizing him, baptized Vladimir. And when the bishop laid his hand upon him, the prince immediately regained his sight. And seeing this sudden cure, Vladimir glorified God, saying, "Now I have known the true God." And I don't have time to get into this section, unfortunately, in our talk today, but this conversion model is, as I show in my book, is very clearly modeled on the liturgical services for both St. Paul the Apostle, who you remember is blinded on the road to Damascus, and of a character we're going to talk a lot about, St. Constantine the Great. All right, so now Vladimir has known the true God. What happens next? Following the supernatural healing at baptism, Vladimir and Anna were married. The prince then conducted his new bride, a company of clerics, and the relics of Saint Clement and Phoebus back to Kiev. Once ensconced in the capital, Vladimir began the work of converting his realm to the new faith. He ordered idols to be overthrown, cut into pieces, and burned. And at his command, a wooden statue of Perun was ceremoniously dumped into the river. Next, the prince summoned the whole city to the banks of the Dnieper, where the priests of the princes and those from Kherson, he presided over the baptism of Rus. And as you see on the slide there, this is an event immortalized on the fresco of in the bell tower of Holy Trinity Monastery, of course, which is where the Russian History Museum is located. All right, so now we've had the mass baptism. Here's how it's described. They went into the water, and some stood up to their necks, but others to their breasts. The younger ones were closer to the bank. Others were holding children in their arms, while the adults waited farther out. The priests stood and performed prayers, and there was joy in heaven and upon earth to behold so many souls saved. At this point, Prince Vladimir looked up to heaven and recited a lengthy prayer of his own, after which he ordered churches to be built in the places where pagan idols once stood. The passage draws to an end with a long and triumphant panegyric, praising the inhabitants of Rus as, quote, a new Christian people, the chosen of God. The religious narrative picks up again 7 years later in the chronicle account for 996. In this passage, Vladimir is described as entering a newly completed church dedicated to the Mother of God, so the Theotokos, or Virgin Mary, and he pronounces another long prayer. The chronicle then elaborates on how the building came to be known as the Church of the Tides, and you see a reconstruction of what that might look like there on the slide. So here's what the chronicle says. After completing the prayer, Vladimir said, "I give to this church of the Holy Mother of God 1/10 of my wealth and that of my cities." And he wrote out a pledge and deposited it in the church, saying, "Anyone who annuls this pledge shall be cursed." And here's another image, which is included in the exhibition of the Russian History Museum, a postcard of St. Vladimir. Now, for all of his repentance and charity, however, Vladimir was born into a violent world, and he ultimately died in a violent world. In the chronicle account for the year 1015, the reader learns that the saintly man passed away while preparing for war against his very own son, Yaroslav. The prince was mourned by boyars and beggars alike, and his body was interred at the Church of the Tides. The chronicle account then concludes with an extensive encomium that proclaims Vladimir to have been a new Constantine of mighty Rome, who was himself baptized and who baptized his people. So that is the story in the chronicle about Prince Vladimir. And what we have to keep in mind, of course, is that none of the manuscripts containing this narrative can be dated to anywhere near the late 10th century or early 11th century. In fact, the versions of events recounted above was probably copied down in the early 12th century by clerics who had never met Vladimir, never laid siege to Kherson, and never heard a philosopher speak to the Kievan court. A span of nearly 130 years separated these events from these chroniclers, from the events they described. I mean, think about it. That's like the same amount of time between the presidency of Bill Clinton and the U.S. Civil War. So we're talking about a long time. If you want to get even more complicated about it, and sadly I don't have time to go into the details, but the actual manuscripts that survive, the earliest of those is the Laurentian Codex, which dates to 1377. So we're talking about almost 400 years. Like the oldest surviving piece of paper that exists with this story on it was copied down 400 years after these events. So that's almost half a millennium, right? We're talking about a long, long time. In fact, so much time had passed, and now I'm talking about that 130-year period, just between the actual historical baptism of Rus and when we're pretty confident that this narrative was copied down, which is the 1110s, basically. So 130 years. When that time had passed, according to the famed philologist Alexei Shakhmatov, by that time the circumstances of the conversion were already long forgotten, a situation that compelled the chroniclers to, quote, build an edifice upon the sand, to resort to borrowings and analogies. The eminent 19th century church historian Yevgeny Golubinsky shared similar doubts about the chronicle report, as did the highly respected Byzantist Fyodor Uspensky, who in 1888 observed that the factual events of the conversion, quote, lie beneath a seal of mystery that no historian using current scientific methods is able to penetrate. And so as a result of this, and again, I cannot actually go into the details because it gets super complicated and super esoteric, and trust me, you do not want to hear it. But as a result of this, one of like the main industries that has surrounded the study of the Rus Primary Chronicle and the story of the baptism of Rus for 250 years now, ever since the Age of Enlightenment, one of the main ways that the people that study this story and this document have kept themselves occupied is by trying to figure out, so, what earlier kinds of materials is this story actually made out of, and who wrote them, and when, and where. And it just becomes this endless hall of mirrors of one hypothetical speculation after another. So we're not going to get into that, but that has strongly characterized the study of this narrative for a very long time. So, if the real historical Vladimir remains shrouded in mystery, what sort of biblical, historiographical, and hagiographical models did the chroniclers draw on when they created the textual figure of Prince Vladimir? And again, we're talking about the character in the story. We're not talking about the actual real historical Vladimir. So, if you were to ask this question, what models? Amidst a gathering of Slavic medievalists, of all those who had ever studied the conversion myth, a great shout would immediately go up throughout the crowd. A chorus of names, ranging from Moses, Melchizedek, and St. Eustace to Justinian the Great and Harald Fairhair of Norway. All of this would be heard amongst the murmur. More frequently, the names of King David and King Solomon would be pronounced, and the name of the Apostle Paul more frequently still. Yet one name, one candidate for the main typological model for Prince Vladimir would ultimately resound above all the rest, the name of Saint Constantine the Great. Now, such a response is probably to be expected. It takes no great skill, after all, to identify a typological model that is explicitly announced in the text of the chronicle. Remember when I said there's that encomium and it includes the words, "This is the new Constantine of mighty Rome." So as the chronicle itself makes clear, the notion that Vladimir played the same role in Rus that Constantine played in Rome was already widespread among the local clergy by the middle of the 11th century. But how, exactly, did the clerics in Kiev know anything about the life and deeds of St. Constantine? Where were they getting their story about the Roman emperor? A number of textual sources have been nominated as candidates. The well-known Yale philologist Riccardo Picchio, for instance, suggests that what he calls the Constantinian model was acculturated in early Rus through Eusebius's famous hagiography, Life of Constantine. This claim is a rather precarious one, however, because there is no evidence that such a text existed in Rus, in Greek, or in Slavonic translation for the entirety of the pre-modern period. Other thinkers maintain that the conversion of Vladimir in the Rus Primary Chronicle is fashioned after the conversion of Constantine in the 9th century Chronicle of George Hamartolas. Now, there is an extant Slavonic translation of this text dating to the early Middle Ages, and its influence on the first Kievan chroniclers is well documented. Yet, and again, I can't go into the details, a side-by-side comparison of the two stories reveals only the most superficial of similarities. So I do not think they got the story from there. Opinions about the conversion are many and diverse, but there is at least one characteristic that unites a good deal of the research. In study after study, when scholars attempt to explain the origins of the national conversion myth, they do so by making recourse to non-extant hypothetical texts. So texts that we don't actually have any evidence that they actually ever existed, except for linguistic and philological kind of conjectures. So the most famous of all the people to ever study the Chronicles, a man named Alexei Shakhmatov, who you see there in the top left corner, he and his followers have claimed that the story about Vladimir is comprised of several earlier tales which were stitched together, and he identifies something that he calls the Kherson legend, which is the story about Vladimir sieging Kherson and getting the princes on, kind of extorting princes on to marry him. And that was combined with what he calls the drevnейший svod, the most ancient chronicle layer, which he thought was composed by clerics at the Church of the Tithes around 1038, 1039. So it's a pretty elaborate theory. Another celebrated doyen of medieval Slavic studies, a man named Dmitry Proftrof, who was actually a Gulag survivor, he conjectured that the Vladimir narrative derives from a hypothetical tale, which he called the tale of the first spread of Christianity in Rus. And Likhatchov thought that this non-extant text was the foundational document of all later history writing in early Rus. Still other scholars, such as Nikolai Serebransky, claim that the stories about Vladimir derive from an ancient and long-vanished saint's life, composed while the prince was still alive. Finally, contemporary scholars such as Igor Danilevsky, among many others, cite chapter and verse from the modern Bible when describing the Vladimir stories. But this is despite the fact that no such book, the Bible, the way we think about the Bible as one book, in between two covers, no such book existed like that in Russia until the year 1499. So, time and again, scholars search for the original sources of the Rus conversion narrative. They find nothing, and then they imagine the existence of hypothetical documents in order to fill in the blanks. But what if there was another possibility, grounded in the analysis of real texts that really survive? What if instead of reconstructing the narratives of imaginary manuscripts, we were to turn attention to the narratives that actually do exist and that are preserved inside of a set of books that represent over 75% of the early medieval period's surviving records? Let me repeat that again. Over 75% of all of the literary documents that survive from this period are church books, service books, liturgical manuscripts. So what, in other words, if we stopped looking for Vladimir's archetypes in hypothetical manuscripts and started looking for them in the liturgical books of the Byzantine Church? My suggestion is that the church services were the source of at least some of the information that scholars traditionally attribute to non-extant tales and hagiographies. And now, if you think about it for a second, this should really not surprise us. After all, who was doing the writing of history in the early Middle Ages? Monks, priests. It was predominantly an ecclesiastical practice. Throughout the medieval Christian world, from Northumbria to Novgorod, so all of Europe, it was clerics who wrote and rewrote, copied and recopied these sacred and political histories of their respective communities. But as we know, this was not their primary occupation. The writers of history were first and foremost bishops, priests, monks, ordained members of a sacerdotal caste dedicated to the celebration of the liturgical services. From dawn to dusk, these clergymen lived in a liturgical world surrounded by liturgical books. The sacred texts were constantly in their hands and before their eyes as they sang